Hi all, Stephanie Rose back again from OWLS. Wanted to share a few things about when you're thinking about sharing out your data analysis, everything you've done through this course or using the roadmap itself. Now you want to share out the insights that you've gained through all of the data that you've analyzed and your root cause analysis, that sort of thing. So as the analyst in this situation or the person that has gone through all of these steps, you've learned a lot and you have insights that you probably want to share with your team, some that might even inform strategy or how you do your work. But how do you really share these effectively? Sometimes we call this storytelling with data. So what does that really mean? To me, I think of sharing headlines or insights from the analysis, potentially an answer to a big strategic question or your problem statement where you started this roadmap. It might be something that your region is really struggling with, something you're trying to implement and wanted to see how it was going. Might be proof for a hypothesis that you had as a region, or potentially disproving a hypothesis. Storytelling with data to me is also, it's a way to present a summary of maybe everything that the analyst, you in this situation, or the team analyzing the data has actually learned through this process, but only really presenting the most impactful things, the things that will actually inform your strategy and change how you're going to do the work, the things that you think your entire staff or team should know, really the summary and the culmination of all the data analysis you have done, and taking all the steps through the roadmap. Also want to think about doing this in the most impactful way for whoever you're sharing this with. If it's your teammates, other staff in your region, your ED and your leadership team, a national team, etc. Really want to keep in mind the audience and who you're actually sharing out to. So let's double click on a few things to kind of norm on what it looks like to tell a story with data. And let's look at a couple of quick examples. So first, this is an internal example. This is work that the OWLS team did with the Nashville region. You'll see some slides here that were helping Nashville go through their 6-question framework. So these slides present just the most salient data for the region around question 1 or progress to date in the community. Not the full gamut of all the analysis and all the data that we looked at, but just the things that the region and OWLS together thought were the most important for their work and for their leadership team to go through this process. So this slide, you'll see some choices that we made here. We minimized the text, just presented a very clear headline for the graph, which largely speaks for itself, as the graph is actually organized by color. It has clip art so that you can see which metric you're looking at. Everything is color coded. Also, some design choices we made on the slide. There were places where metrics changed. So, for example, the state test changed here. And so we wanted to show that these data points were not actually comparable, but did still want to show the data that we had and the trends that we were seeing. As, for example, some scores here were actually trending up before the test was changed. So just a few things that we decided to do in terms of presenting this data in the way that was clear for the audience. Now, skipping ahead to slide 5, again, this is the same Nashville example. You'll see another graph, but this time with more text to kind of further highlight the progress that's being talked about on this slide. This time, the graph itself and the data points that are talked about is all looking at declining suspension rates for students in Metro Nashville Public Schools. And again, we used color coding here. We looked at suspension rates by race and also just created a few very quick and succinct data points with a very clear headline that suspension rates are declining in Metro Nashville Public Schools. Shifting gears to another example, this time work that we did with the Bay region. Just a recent example from OWLS work. Here, this was something that we did to kind of look at matriculation and confirmation data with the Bay region. And we actually walked them through the full roadmap process as well. That's later in the deck. But here on this slide, I was just trying to visualize some key headlines from taking a really thorough look at all of the Bay's matriculation data. This slide and the couple slides that I pulled together in no way summarizes everything that I found, but I just kind of pulled out the key headlines, things that I thought were most important to inform strategy for the staff in the Bay. So here on the slide, I used both text to summarize some of the headlines, as well as graphs that show both the number of accepted applicants that were lost in each of these categories and the matriculation rates. And I kind of circled for emphasis where rates were very low and thought this was a group that probably needed more attention or support throughout the process, or even just trying to figure out what is going on and why they're not matriculating at higher rates like the rest of the cohort. I made these choices after doing all of the analysis and aligning sort of on the need to know headlines. And from there, I created the visuals and added text that I thought made those headlines clear, even if you're a staff member who had not seen the underlying data. I also wanted to incorporate some quotes from actual applicants. So these were from some of the surveys that were given. Just because I do think that when you're dealing with some qualitative data, even if it's just from surveys, there are open-ended comments, it really can help bring themes to life if you are able to include quotes from the actual stakeholders in the data that you're studying. All right, so back to some sort of general tips and tricks. How do you create a strong deliverable that actually can summarize everything that you've gone through in analyzing the data, going through root cause analysis, everything you've done in the roadmap? A few sort of tips and tricks here. I think the thing for me that I think the most about is how do you tell the story? If you really step back on everything you've learned, all the data you've looked at, how you've arrived at like proving or disproving a hypothesis, what is the story that you tell? Sometimes I just actually tell the story to a person or write it down in some way to get a really good sense for what is sticking out in my mind. What do I think are the need to knows, especially if you're thinking about something that will inform strategy. Because a good deliverable and a good presentation will actually tell that story that you've spent so long, going through data and trying to really uncover. Another thing that's really helpful to keep in mind is the framework. So if you were with me in the first video that I did for this roadmap course, we talked a little bit about an example in Las Vegas, and there we had really clear hypotheses that we were going to test through the sort of like process that the roadmap goes through. And for that particular engagement, we used that then as a framework to also share back out the results, because when we were talking with the regional team, they had these clear hypotheses. Everything we were doing was to test those hypotheses. And so it makes sense that that would be sort of our framework for how we present the results. So in that work, we started with those hypotheses, and then we basically pulled together a final presentation, so a deck in this case, where we had pretty much a section for each hypothesis that went over the most relevant data, both quantitative and qualitative, that would either support and or contradict the hypothesis. So that included charts and graphs from the quantitative data, as well as quotes from alums that we spoke with to really help bring the story to life. And that way there was a clear section on each sort of hypothesis where someone could double click and go deeper. But from that, we also created an executive summary slide with sort of the highest level conclusions around each hypothesis. So if you have 2 minutes and you can only read one thing, that's sort of where you go. That's what you can actually look at to see what hypothesis was true, what did we find, where were certain things driving alumni attrition or not. And then we also went a step further to actually provide recommendations for strategy based on what we heard and saw in the data, again, aligned to each specific hypothesis. So I've gone over most of the stuff on this slide, but I think a few other things to pull out. In terms of backwards planning, again, that kind of starts from how do you tell the story? And then from there, you can kind of like frame your deliverable. So making sure in your mind, what are the key things you really need to cover? create a slide for each thing, or make sure that you're starting with that and doing the charts and graphs and quotes that really illuminate the things that you would highlight in your story as you're telling it. Always create an executive summary. I always also do this last. I think once you get really clear on the story you're telling, the data you're using to tell the story, it then is even another great step to kind of just bubble up what are the real headlines, like the highest level. If you're an ED and you have 30 seconds to read something, okay, maybe 2 minutes to read something. What are the need to know things, and really what is all the data telling you? Another tip and trick, I guess, that I use a lot, I have sort of a suite of charts and graphs and templates that I use, all TFA branded, you know, with TFA colors and that sort of thing, just so it's easy for me to pull in, like, oh, I really need a stacked bar graph, and I know that I really want another line that goes through with like a second axis. I think I did that here, or I have this template here, so you don't have to start things from scratch. And you have lots of examples to pull from. That helps me, and it saves time. Also, a couple other things about just your audience. For people who don't work with data on a daily basis, you can get kind of bogged down or fixated on the actual numbers themselves at times. So if that's the case, if you know that that's the case with the audience you're presenting to, you might want to use language such as a majority or most or less than a quarter or something like that instead of 33.32%, because then they might be fixated on, well, how do we get it to 34%, versus the actual, you know, takeaway of the data itself. Otherwise, I think using TFA branding, using the colors, just keeping things consistent. The branding is really great for a clear, concise story, a visually pleasing, you know, deck or document, whatever you're working in. So I try to always just keep things handy that are templates I can pull from, so that I have something to start from. Okay, so you've created some sort of deliverable. You've told your story of the data, probably in a PowerPoint deck or a Word document, something like that. If you're also going to present your findings, let's say to your ED, a leadership team, other staff, a few things here to keep in mind. You might want to provide your actual physical deliverable, if it's a deck or whatever, ahead of time as sort of a pre-read. Just for those who need time to kind of digest and make sense of the data you're presenting. That also gives people time, especially with a prompt, to come up with any questions they have, so that when you're actually in the presentation and you're doing the meeting, you can go over in real time the biggest questions on people's minds and really have a productive conversation. From there, your objective, you know, when you're actually in front of people, when you have your audience and you're in this meeting or presentation, your objective really should be to clearly communicate all of the stuff that's need to know, right? Your need to know information, your story of all the data and the analysis that you did, and also the sort of so what, now what, if it's applicable. By so what, now what, I mean, what are the implications of your findings? Any hypotheses that you proved or disproved? What does that mean for your strategy, for your work? Just so that people are really clear and you can start that dialogue around not just what did we find in the data, but now what do we do with the insights that we gained. You'll also want to ensure that you really cater to your audience. So think about, what is their knowledge of this data that you've gone over or the process that you went through? Do you need to start with a quick introduction to the data or the process itself, or, you know, the project, just so that they can ground in sort of like what you're trying to cover, what has already been done. Also, what are their roles and what is the work that they do? So how do these findings that you're going to present actually impact their daily work? If you can think about their motivations or what they'd be most interested in, you can start from that place to really engage the audience. Also, what motivates your audience, or what altitude are they used to operating at? So thinking about what will be most helpful for them, specifically, what kind of information do they want to know, need to know in their work in order to keep them engaged. I think a few other things on this slide just to cover are thinking about answering the questions that your client or audience has. Again, if you do send something as pre-work, you can even ask people to send you their questions ahead of time so that you're prepared in the meeting. or if it's just sort of like a casual meeting where everyone's having a discussion, just make sure that you have some backup data if you need it to answer specific questions, or you can come back to people later with the data. But being really sure that you can start a dialogue and answer the questions that people have about, especially how to move forward. Any strategy implications from this data will be really helpful in real time in your meeting. One thing that always helps me is to practice telling the story. So before I go and present something to a client, especially if it's really quick meeting or really high profile people I'm talking to, I like to practice. I like to make sure that I am really clear on the key points that I want to hit on, that I can tell the story in a way that's really clear and engaging. I also have in the past found it really helpful to see others and watch others present information or tell their story with data, just to see, you kind of pick up tips and tricks, seeing others do this and seeing how they engage their audience and the choices they make and how to facilitate the meeting to really clearly get their points across. And last, if you're going to engage in a full process or you're really walking through, a whole session design, you might just want to collect some protocols or other session designs from other teammates who've done these types of things more often. On OWLS, we have various examples and we're happy to share them with you. So if it's, really leading your team through maybe like a whole roadmap process, or you want to lead them through all of the different steps that you took, and it's more of like a day-long engagement or something. We have lots of different facilitation choices and things that you can use so that you don't have to start from scratch and you're not kind of like trying to figure out what's the best way to do all of these different things when others have made these choices before. So those are some high-level tips and tricks in terms of how you present the data and how you share your insights and implications for strategy with your team or with an audience. I'd be happy to answer questions or talk with you more about this. So please do reach out on the OWLS Slack channel or feel free to reach out to me as well. Thank you.